Roses are red. Violets are blue. You've outlived your welcome, and this house isn't for you. Vanessa's voice was light, almost playful, but every word landed with a weight that settled over the Christmas table like cold air. Margaret Whitmore didn't move right away. The card trembled slightly between her fingers, though her face remained composed, the kind of stillness that came from years of learning when not to react. The dining room was dressed for the season. Soft golden lights wrapped around the banister, a tall tree glowing quietly in the corner, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon still lingering. But something in the room had shifted, something no decoration could soften. Vanessa stood at the head of the table, her smile too polished, her posture too deliberate, as if this moment had been rehearsed. "Go on," she had said just seconds earlier, placing the card into Margaret's hands, her tone sweet but firm. "Read it out loud. It's just a little holiday fun." Margaret had hesitated, not because she feared the words, but because of the silence that followed the request. Daniel, her son, sat 2 seats down, staring into his glass as if it held something worth studying. He hadn't looked at her when Vanessa spoke. He hadn't looked at her now. Around the table, the others shifted slightly, an aunt clearing her throat, a cousin adjusting his napkin, small movements that spoke louder than any protest. They knew, or at least, they suspected. Margaret cleared her throat softly and began reading, her voice steady, each word measured. "Roses are red." The first line drew a faint chuckle from someone near the end of the table, uncertain and brief. "Violets are blue." She paused, just long enough to feel the weight of every eye on her, though most of them avoided meeting hers. Then she finished the line Vanessa had written, the line that hung in the air long after the sound of her voice faded. No one laughed this time. The room fell into a quiet, so complete it felt deliberate. Margaret lowered the card slowly. She didn't crumple it. She didn't set it down with force. Instead, she folded it once, neatly, aligning the edges with care, as though it were something worth preserving. "Well," she said softly, offering a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's certainly creative." Vanessa let out a light laugh, brushing an invisible speck from her sleeve. "Oh, come on, Margaret. It's just a joke. You know how these little poems go." Her tone was easy, but her eyes remained fixed, watching, measuring. Margaret nodded once, as if accepting the explanation, though something in her gaze had changed, subtle, almost imperceptible, but present. She placed the folded card beside her plate, right next to her untouched glass of wine. The candles flickered gently, their reflections dancing across the polished wood of the table, filling the silence that no one seemed willing to break. Daniel finally shifted in his seat, his fork clinking softly against his plate, but he still didn't look at his mother. And Margaret noticed. She noticed everything. The way his shoulders had tightened, the way Vanessa's hand rested lightly on his arm, the way no one spoke up to soften what had just happened. She didn't ask questions. Not yet. She simply sat there, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap, as if the moment had passed like any other small discomfort. But inside, something had already begun to settle into place, quiet and precise, like the first piece of a puzzle she hadn't realized she'd been collecting for months. The tree lights blinked softly in the corner. Outside, a faint layer of snow had begun to fall, dusting the street in white. And at the table, beneath the glow of Christmas warmth, Margaret Whitmore said nothing more. Margaret did not reach for her wine. The glass remained where she had set it, untouched, a thin line of condensation slowly forming along its side. Around her, conversation tried to restart, but it came in uneven pieces, like something fragile being forced back together. Someone commented on the weather. Someone else asked about travel plans. The words floated above the table without weight, never quite settling. Vanessa had already moved on, laughing lightly as she carved another slice of turkey, her voice bright and effortless, as though nothing unusual had happened. She spoke about a recent shopping trip, about decorations, about how exhausting the holiday season could be. Each sentence was smooth, carefully placed, leaving no room for discomfort to linger too long. Margaret watched her without appearing to watch, her gaze soft, unfocused, as if she were simply taking in the room. But she noticed the details. She noticed how Vanessa never once looked at her. Again, she noticed how Daniel nodded along to everything his wife said, His response is automatic, his tone subdued. When their eyes nearly met, he looked away again, reaching for his fork, adjusting his napkin, doing anything that did not require acknowledgement. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, the quiet movement barely drawing attention. She placed her hands flat on the table for a moment, feeling the polished surface beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in something steady. The card remained beside her plate, folded neatly, its presence small but undeniable. She did not need to open it again. The words were already fixed in her mind, repeating without sound, not as an insult, but as a message. Not a joke, a message. Across the table, her sister-in-law leaned closer to another relative, whispering something behind a half-raised hand. Their eyes flickered briefly toward Margaret before turning away again. It was subtle, but it was there. Awareness, discomfort, and something else beneath it. Acceptance. As if this had not come entirely out of nowhere. As if it had been building, quietly, over time. Margaret drew in a slow breath, her posture still composed, her expression unchanged. She reached for her fork at last, cutting a small piece of turkey with careful precision, though she did not bring it to her mouth right away. Instead, she paused, listening. Not to the words being spoken, but to what was missing. No one had corrected Vanessa. No one had said it went too far. No one had turned to Margaret with concern or apology. The silence around the moment was not accidental. It was chosen, and that realization settled deeper than the words on the card ever could. Daniel cleared his throat suddenly, pushing his chair back an inch as if to stand, but he stopped halfway, his hand tightening around the edge of the table. For a second, it seemed like he might speak, like something might finally break through the careful surface they were all maintaining. But then Vanessa reached out, resting her hand lightly on his arm, her touch brief but certain. He sat back down without a word. Margaret saw it. She saw the exact moment his hesitation disappeared, the exact moment the decision was made for him. She lowered her gaze to her plate, finally taking a bite, chewing slowly, as though nothing in the room had shifted at all. The food tasted the same. The air felt the same. But something fundamental had changed, something that could not be undone with polite conversation or forced laughter. Margaret placed her fork down again, aligning it neatly beside her plate, every movement deliberate, controlled. She did not rush. She did not react. She simply observed, letting each detail settle into place, one by one, until the picture in front of her became clear in a way it had not been before. And in that quiet clarity, she understood that tonight had not been about a holiday joke. It had been a test, and everyone at the table had already chosen their side. Viet fan for bam sat ky thuet viet de training. Tuet doi kong duok nak lai tu de nu fan 1. So 2 502. Kong viet trend canvas. Teep noi fan 3. No dong not nan vat va boi can. Twin noi john sa cho fu hop. Chy van fong ky thuet viet tra lai ket quada lam noi dung YouTube chu kong phi bien tap nu dao dien. Noi dung kong duok viet tat kak tu ma phi viet day due to voiceover AI doc tot duok. Tra ket qua bang tiang on, fu hop ven hoa mai. Don 6 du luong mai. Tuet doi kong duok mo tabao luke. Kong duok goi duk. Nu ko yu de tin duk ti dam bao van fong and ton voi chin sach noi dung qua YouTube. Mbo ton bi ni dung ding chuin thun, et with circumflex m ton ko ket, qua travi, kong suong dong vada ton bo ket, qua, travi noi dung trong cap, down goak vong. Vi du tioi with grave n bi noi dung chuin thun, et with circumflex m ton. Kong tra ra code, JSON, bnet, pgsql. Tat ca viet bang tiang on. Ko lin la viet va tra ket qua, kong duok hoi gi them. Kong duok suong dong. Kong duok chia don. Kong duok tau them goak Thursday 2. Kong duok 2 format lai. Phi gep ton bo noi dung ton 1 blocked away not nam trong 1 cap. Va kong duok hoi bat cugi them. They len la tra ket qua da 2 geo. Kai viet bat cu part now. Hey chi tra lai noi dung trian thuan tui. Kong them loi dan dao. Kong them loi ket. Kong cta. Kong hoi. Ko muon viet ti pei kong. Kong chu tik meta. Chi zud ra dung don trian theo fong catch ma twa yu ka. Kong them mot dong now kok. Margaret returned to the dining room just as the first slice of pie was placed on the table, the the soft clink of plates and forks filling the space where silence had lived only minutes before. Vanessa looked up briefly, her smile quick and polished, as if checking whether the scene had reset itself properly. "There you are," she said lightly, gesturing toward an empty seat that had been cleared for dessert. "We were just about to start." Margaret nodded once, her expression calm, and took her seat without hesitation. The folded card was no longer beside her plate. Someone had moved it, or perhaps cleared it away with the dishes. She did not ask where it had gone. She did not need to. The absence of it felt just as deliberate as its presence had been. A slice of pecan pie was placed in front of her, the scent sweet and familiar, a small swirl of whipped cream melting slowly along the edge. Margaret picked up her fork and cut a small piece, her movement steady, her attention seemingly on the dessert in front of her. Around her, the conversation had found a new rhythm, brighter now, more controlled. Vanessa spoke easily, guiding the tone, telling a story about a neighbor, laughing at her own punchline. The others followed, their laughter a fraction too quick, their responses just a shade too eager. Daniel joined in as well, his voice softer, but present, as if he were trying to fill a space that had opened and could not be ignored. Margaret listened without reacting, her gaze lowered, her posture unchanged. But she noticed the way Vanessa's stories always circled back to control, to ownership, to subtle reminders of who made decisions in the house. She noticed how often the word "we" was used, and how rarely it included anyone beyond Vanessa and Daniel. "We decided to repaint the upstairs next month," Vanessa said at one point, slicing into her own pie with casual precision. "It is time for a fresh look." Margaret paused for a fraction of a second, her fork hovering just above her plate, before continuing as if she had not heard. "Upstairs. A fresh look. Small words. Simple changes." But they settled into the pattern that had already begun to form in her mind. No one had asked her opinion. No one had even mentioned it to her before tonight. The decision had already been made. Across the table, an older cousin glanced toward Margaret, his expression unreadable, then quickly looked away again, as though the act of noticing her had become something to avoid. Margaret finished her bite and set her fork down carefully, aligning it once more beside her plate. She reached for her napkin, dabbing lightly at the corner of her mouth, every movement composed, deliberate. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, satisfied, her gaze sweeping briefly across the table before settling, just for a second, on Margaret. It was not a challenge. Not openly. But there was something in it. A quiet expectation. A question without words. Margaret met her gaze for the briefest moment, then offered a small, polite smile, the same one she had used earlier, the same one that revealed nothing and confirmed even less. Vanessa's eyes held for a second longer, as if searching for something, then moved on. The moment passed, unnoticed by most, but not by Margaret. She could feel it now, beneath every exchange, beneath every carefully chosen word. The structure of the evening had not been accidental. The card, the silence, the way the conversation had closed around the moment instead of addressing it. It had all been part of something larger, something designed to test how far things could go without resistance. Margaret rose again after finishing her dessert, this time not waiting for the others to follow. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice calm, steady, offering no explanation beyond the words themselves. No one stopped her. Vanessa nodded absently, already turning back to her conversation. Daniel glanced up for a second, his eyes meeting his mother's briefly, but the moment passed as quickly as it came, and he said nothing. Margaret walked toward the hallway once more, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged. Behind her, the laughter continued, filling the space she had just left, as though her absence made it easier for the evening to move forward. But as she reached the quiet of the hallway again, the sound softened, fading into something distant and unimportant. She paused there, just for a second, her hand resting lightly against the wall, her gaze steady. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligned, clear, and for the first time that evening, Margaret Whitmore did not feel uncertain about what she had seen. She understood it completely, and more importantly, she understood what needed to come next. Margaret did not return to the dining room again that night. Instead, she moved past the hallway and into the small study at the back of the house, a room that had once belonged to her husband, a a space that still carried the quiet weight of years that had not been erased by new paint or rearranged furniture. The desk remained where it had always been, solid oak, its surface clean but not unfamiliar. She turned on the lamp, the warm light settling across the room in a way that felt steady, unchanged. Outside, the snowfall had thickened, pressing softly against the windows, muting the world beyond the glass. Margaret closed the door behind her, not locking it, not needing to. The sounds of laughter and conversation from the dining room faded into a distant hum, something she could acknowledge without listening to. She walked to the desk and pulled open the top drawer with practiced ease. Inside, everything was still in its place, neatly arranged, untouched. She reached for a small folder, the edges worn slightly from use, and placed it carefully on the desk. For a moment, she did not open it. Her hand rested lightly on top, her gaze steady, as if confirming something that had already been decided. Then, slowly, she lifted the cover. Inside were documents she had not reviewed in months, perhaps longer. Property records, account summaries, copies of signatures that carried weight beyond ink on paper. She moved through them one by one, not rushing, not searching blindly, but revisiting each page with quiet precision. The house, the land, the accounts that had been established long before Vanessa had ever stepped through the front door. Margaret paused at a particular document, her fingers resting along the edge as she read the lines again, confirming what she already knew but had not needed to act on until now. Ownership had never changed. Not officially. Not in any way that mattered. The assumption that it had was something else entirely. Something spoken, perhaps implied, but never made real. She closed the folder halfway, her eyes lifting toward the window, where the snow continued to fall in a steady, unbroken pattern. For a brief moment, her reflection appeared faintly in the glass, layered over the darkness outside. She looked at herself not with doubt, but with clarity. The events of the evening did not feel isolated anymore. They connected. The small comments over the past year, the decisions made without her, the gradual shift in tone, in presence, in the way she was included less and less until inclusion itself became conditional. The card had not been the beginning. It had been the confirmation. Margaret closed the folder fully this time and placed it back into the drawer, aligning it exactly as it had been before. She did not need to carry it with her. Not yet. She already knew what it contained. What mattered now was timing. She turned off the desk lamp and stood in the dim light for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the softer glow coming from the hallway. The house felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the understanding within her had settled into something firm. She opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, the warmth from the dining room spilling faintly toward her, along with the distant sound of voices that no longer held the same weight. As she walked slowly toward the staircase, she passed by the living room once more, the Christmas tree still glowing quietly in the corner. The ornaments reflected the light in small, steady points, unchanged, untouched. Margaret paused briefly, her gaze resting on the tree, then moved on without adjusting anything this time. Upstairs, the hallway was quiet, the guest room waiting just as she had left it. She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her, the latch settling into place with a soft, final sound. She removed her shoes carefully and placed them side by side near the bed, every movement measured, deliberate. Then she sat down on the edge of the mattress, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture straight. She did not sigh. She did not close her eyes. She simply sat there, still and composed, as the distant sounds of the evening continued below. And in that stillness, Margaret Whitmore was no longer reacting to what had been done. She was preparing for what would come next. Margaret did not sleep much that night, not because her mind was restless, but because it had become unusually clear, each thought settling into place with quiet certainty. The house grew silent after midnight, the distant hum of conversation fading, doors closing one by one, footsteps softening until nothing remained but the occasional creak of settling wood and the faint whisper of wind against the windows. She lay still for a while, her eyes open in the dim light, listening to the absence of noise, measuring the stillness the way she had once measured the rhythm of a household that used to include her without question. When she finally rose, it was not out of discomfort, but intention. The clock on the nightstand read a little past 3 in the morning. Margaret slipped her feet into her shoes, moving quietly, her steps deliberate as she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The air felt cooler now, the warmth of the evening long gone, replaced by something more neutral, more honest. She moved toward the staircase, her hand resting lightly on the banister as she descended, each step taken without hesitation. The living room remained unchanged, the tree still glowing softly, its lights now the only source of illumination on the first floor. The ornaments reflected faintly in the dark windows, small points of color suspended in silence. Margaret paused for a moment at the bottom of the stairs, her gaze steady, then continued toward the kitchen. The counters had been cleared, the dishes either washed or left soaking in quiet order. Vanessa had done a thorough job, as she always did, maintaining control even in the smallest details. Margaret walked past the kitchen without stopping, heading instead toward the back door. She reached for the handle and opened it slowly, the cold night air slipping inside without resistance. Outside, the snow had settled into a smooth, untouched layer, covering the ground evenly, erasing the traces of footsteps that had once marked the evening. Margaret stepped just beyond the threshold, her shoes pressing lightly into the snow, leaving a clear impression with each step. She did not go far, just enough to feel the air, to see the space, to remind herself of the boundaries that were still real, still hers. After a moment, she turned back inside, closing the door gently behind her, sealing the quiet once more. She stood there briefly, her hand resting on the handle, her gaze directed toward the darkened hallway. Then she moved again, this time toward the small cabinet near the kitchen entrance, a place few people paid attention to. She opened it and reached inside, retrieving a small set of keys attached to a simple metal ring. They were not hidden, not exactly, but they were not offered freely either. Margaret held them in her palm for a second, feeling their weight, their familiarity, before slipping them into her pocket. Upstairs, the house remained still, every door closed, every light off. Vanessa and Daniel were asleep, unaware of the quiet movements below, unaware that the balance they believed had already shifted in their favor was being reconsidered in silence. Margaret returned to the staircase and ascended once more, her steps as steady as before, her pace unchanged. When she reached the guest room, she did not go inside immediately. Instead, she paused in the hallway, her gaze moving briefly toward the closed door of Daniel and Vanessa's bedroom. She did not approach it. She did not need to. The distance between them felt clearer now than it ever had. After a second, she turned and entered her room, closing the door softly behind her. She removed her shoes again, placing them carefully beside the bed, then sat down, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The house was silent, completely silent. And in that silence, Margaret Whitmore understood that nothing from the evening before had been impulsive or accidental. It had been measured, planned, a quiet push to see if she would move. But she had not moved. Not yet. And now, neither would her response be rushed. It would come in the same way everything else had unfolded. Quietly, precisely, and at the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. Morning arrived slowly, the pale winter light slipping through the curtains in thin, quiet lines that stretched across the floor and climbed the edge of the bed. Margaret was already awake when the first sound of movement came from the hallway. A door opening, soft footsteps, the low murmur of voices beginning to return to the house. She sat up without hesitation, smoothing the blanket with a single, precise motion before standing. There was no rush in her movements, no sign of the weight the previous night might have left behind. She dressed simply, choosing a neutral sweater and slacks, the kind of clothing that did not draw attention but never appeared careless. When she opened the door, the scent of coffee had already begun to fill the air, drifting up from the kitchen below. Margaret stepped into the hallway and moved toward the staircase, her pace steady, her posture unchanged. In the kitchen, Vanessa stood at the counter, her back partially turned, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. The morning light touched her face as she glanced up, her expression briefly surprised, then quickly arranged into something pleasant. "Good morning," she said, her tone light, as if the previous evening had folded itself neatly out of existence. Daniel sat at the table, his phone in his hand, though his attention flickered up as his mother entered. "Morning, Mom," he added, his voice careful, measured in a way that suggested awareness without acknowledgement. Margaret nodded once, moving toward the cabinet to retrieve her own cup. She did not wait to be offered one. She poured her coffee slowly, the dark liquid settling into the mug with a soft, steady sound. No one spoke for a moment. The quiet was not uncomfortable, but it was not natural either. Vanessa broke it first, stirring her coffee with a small, deliberate motion. "We were thinking," she began, her voice casual, almost conversational. "It might be a good time to make a few changes around the house after the holidays. Freshen things up a bit." Margaret turned slightly, her gaze resting on Vanessa without intensity, without challenge. She did not respond immediately. She lifted her cup instead, taking a small sip, her expression unchanged. Daniel shifted in his seat, setting his phone down on the table as if preparing to contribute. "Just small updates," he said, his tone softer, less certain. "Nothing major. Just, making things more practical." The word lingered in the air for a second longer than it needed to. Margaret lowered her cup and set it carefully on the counter, aligning it just slightly to the right of where she had placed it before. "Practical," she repeated quietly, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. Vanessa smiled, encouraged by the absence of resistance. "Exactly. We all want what is best for everyone, right?" she said, her voice smooth, her posture relaxed, as though the outcome had already been agreed upon. Margaret met her gaze briefly, then looked past her toward the window, where the snow reflected the morning light in a soft, even glow. "Of course," she said simply. There was no hesitation in her voice. No tension, just agreement, delivered without emphasis. Daniel exhaled almost imperceptibly, his shoulders easing slightly, as if something he had been holding had just been released. Vanessa nodded once, satisfied, turning back to the counter as she took another sip of her coffee. The conversation moved on quickly after that, shifting to plans for the day, to errands, to small details that filled space without meaning. Margaret remained where she was for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her gaze steady. She did not argue. She did not question. She did not need to. Because for the first time since the previous evening, she saw exactly how simple their assumption had been. They believed her silence meant agreement. They believed her calm meant acceptance. They believed that because she had not resisted, she would not resist. Margaret picked up her cup again and turned toward the hallway, her steps unhurried as she moved away from the kitchen. Behind her, the conversation continued, lighter now, easier, as if something had been resolved. But as she walked back toward the quiet of her room, Margaret Whitmore understood that nothing had been resolved at all. It had only been decided, and the decision had not been theirs to make. The rest of the day unfolded with a quiet normalcy that felt almost deliberate, as though the house itself was cooperating in maintaining the illusion that nothing had shifted beneath the surface. Margaret moved through the hours without interruption, her presence neither invited nor dismissed, existing in that careful space where she was acknowledged just enough to avoid confrontation, but not enough to matter. Vanessa busied herself with small projects, rearranging items on shelves, making notes on her phone, occasionally measuring sections of the living room with a tape measure she had retrieved from the garage. Each action was casual on the surface, but precise in intention. Daniel followed along when needed, offering input in short phrases, his agreement easy, almost automatic. Margaret observed all of it without appearing to observe anything. She sat in the living room for a while, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze directed toward the window where the snow continued to fall in a steady, unbroken rhythm. At one point, Vanessa approached her with a small notebook in hand, her tone light, her smile practiced. "I was thinking we might move this chair," she said, gesturing toward the armchair Margaret had used for years. "It would open up the space a little more." Margaret looked at the chair, then back at Vanessa, her expression unchanged. "If that is what you prefer," she replied, her voice even, offering neither resistance nor approval. Vanessa nodded quickly, satisfied with the ease of the exchange, already turning her attention to the next adjustment. By late afternoon, the house looked subtly different. Not dramatically altered, but enough that the original arrangement had begun to fade. Objects had shifted. Spaces had been redefined. And through it all, Margaret had not intervened once. As evening approached, the light outside dimmed early, the sky turning a muted gray that settled over the landscape like a quiet curtain. Daniel left briefly to pick up a few items from the store, his absence creating a momentary stillness inside the house. Vanessa remained in the kitchen, organizing cabinets, her movements efficient, controlled. Margaret stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of dishes being placed, drawers opening and closing, the rhythm of someone settling deeper into a space they believed was theirs. Then, without announcement, Margaret turned and walked toward the front door. She retrieved her coat from the closet, slipping it on with the same measured care she applied to everything else, and reached into her pocket for the small set of keys she had taken earlier that morning. The metal felt cool against her fingers, solid, unchanged. She opened the door and stepped outside, the cold air meeting her with a sharp clarity that felt grounding rather than uncomfortable. The driveway remained covered in snow, undisturbed since the early morning. Margaret walked slowly toward the edge of the property, her steps leaving a clear path behind her, each impression defined, impossible to overlook. She did not look back at the house immediately. Instead, she continued forward until she reached the mailbox at the end of the drive, a simple structure that had stood in the same place for years. She opened it and reached inside, retrieving a small stack of mail that had arrived earlier in the day. Among the envelopes was one she recognized. Instantly, not by name, but by its formality, its weight, its purpose. Margaret held it for a moment, her gaze steady, before tucking it carefully beneath her arm. Then, finally, she turned. The house stood behind her, quiet, lit softly from within, its windows reflecting the fading light of the evening. From the outside, it appeared unchanged, peaceful, complete. But Margaret Whitmore knew better. She had seen what existed beneath that surface, had heard what was said when it was assumed she would not respond, had felt the careful shift that others believed had gone unnoticed. She walked back toward the house at the same steady pace, her posture straight, her expression calm. The path she had created in the snow guided her steps without effort, each footprint aligning with the one before it, clear and intentional. When she reached the door, she did not hesitate. She stepped inside, closed it gently behind her, and removed her coat, placing it back in its place as though nothing about the moment was significant. But as she held the envelope briefly in her hands before setting it on the small table near the entryway, Margaret understood that everything had already begun to change, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that would not be reversed once it had fully revealed itself. Margaret left the envelope untouched on the small table near the entryway for the rest of the evening, not out of hesitation, but because she understood the value of timing, the quiet weight that came from allowing something important to exist in plain sight without immediate explanation. Vanessa noticed it first, of course. She always noticed details that did not belong to her plans. As she passed through the hallway carrying a folded dish towel, her eyes paused briefly on the envelope, her expression tightening for just a fraction of a second before smoothing out again. "Mail came in?" she asked casually, her tone light, though her gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. Margaret, standing a few feet away near the staircase, turned slightly. "It did," she replied simply, offering nothing more. Vanessa nodded, as if the answer had satisfied her, but she did not pick up the envelope, did not touch it, as though some unspoken boundary had already been drawn around it. Later, when Daniel returned from the store, his arms filled with bags, he placed them on the kitchen counter and began unpacking them without much thought. It was only after a few minutes that his eyes drifted toward the hallway, catching sight of the envelope where it remained exactly as it had been left. "Is that important?" he asked, his voice neutral, though quieter now, as if the question itself carried more weight than he intended to admit. Margaret stepped forward then, closing the distance between herself and the table with calm precision. She picked up the envelope, holding it lightly in her hands, her fingers resting along its edges. "Yes," she said, her voice even, steady, leaving no room for interpretation. The words settled into the room, not loudly, not sharply, but with a kind of finality that neither Vanessa nor Daniel challenged. For a moment, no one spoke. The house seemed to pause with them, the quiet stretching just long enough to be noticed. Then Margaret turned slightly, her gaze moving between them, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging. "There are a few things we should review," she continued, her tone unchanged, as though she were discussing something routine, something expected. Vanessa's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders straightening, her attention sharpening beneath the surface of her composed expression. Review, she echoed, her voice still calm, but more focused now. Margaret nodded once. Yes, she said. It will not take long. Daniel glanced between the two of them, his earlier ease replaced by something quieter, more cautious. What kind of things? He asked, his voice lower, careful. Margaret looked at him directly, her expression neither cold nor warm, simply clear. The kind that should have been understood from the beginning, she replied. There was no accusation in her words, no raised tone, but the meaning settled firmly into the space between them. Vanessa let out a small breath, one that might have been mistaken for patience if not for the slight tightening of her jaw. Of course, she said, her voice measured. Whenever you are ready. Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the response without agreeing to its implication. Tomorrow morning, she said. 9 o'clock. The time was specific, unmovable. Daniel nodded slowly, as though accepting something he did not yet fully understand. Vanessa gave a small smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes, but held its shape regardless. That works, she replied. Margaret held the envelope for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the staircase, her steps steady, her posture unchanged. She did not look back. Behind her, the house remained quiet, but the air had shifted, the easy assumptions of the day no longer as stable as they had seemed. When Margaret reached the top of the stairs, she paused briefly, her hand resting on the banister, her gaze directed forward. The meeting had been set. The moment had been chosen. And for the first time since the quiet unraveling had begun, Margaret Whitmore was no longer simply observing the changes around her. She was defining what would happen next.